In Chapter 2, we will look at the ways that developmental psychologists have researched some of the findings we'll be discussing throughout class. Some of the most common research methods are through systematic observation. That is to say that when you go to a park, for example, you can observe individuals in their natural habitat. For example, looking at a child at a playground allows you to understand why they behave the way they behave. However, there are two different types of systematic observation. You have naturalistic observation and structured. Naturalistic observation is basically observing an individual in a natural environment. Again, at a child, at a playground. The pros of that is that it could really show us everyday behavior as it occurs naturally. But the problem with that is that we may not be able to control conditions. For example, you cannot go over to the park, and if you suspect that the parent is influencing the child's behavior, you cannot ask the parent to leave for an hour to see how the child's behavior would change. In a structured observation, you observe behavior in a laboratory, which would allow you to examine everything in the same condition as you would be able to control for a few of the things. If you were to be at a park and you want to see if a child is willing to share a swing with a stranger, and then the ice cream truck drives by, and then the child gives up the swing, it's possible that the child is not necessarily kind or nice. It's possible that that uncontrolled variable, which would be the ice cream truck, played a role in the child's behavior. This is where a structured observation allows you to maintain the conditions the same for everyone, and that would allow each participant to get an opportunity to display a behavior of interest and conditions that would be controlled by you. The cons of a structured observation is that as much as you may want to make a laboratory similar to a playground, there may be a strange feeling to it, and we cannot always get that natural behavior. There are also clinical reports and self-reports that we use. When we look at a clinical interview, it's basically an interview in which we try to get information about the way the participant feels, their thoughts, and their behaviors. This is a very flexible approach to getting in touch and building rapport with the participant. It really allows us to ask them how their day was. It allows us to discuss weather changes or anything because it's very flexible. However, when we deal with a structured interview, which is another form of self-report, a participant must be asked the exact same question through either a survey or a questionnaire. While this may make it a lot more rigid than the clinical interview, it allows us to compare the findings and allows us to standardize them. If you remember from high school where you took an SAT or the California exam, there were instructions read out by the proctor that were very specific, even annoying sometimes. Now, everybody put your pencil down. Bubble in questions 2 and 3. Now, close the booklet. It seemed very mechanical, and it seemed as though it made it inhumane. The thing is that the reason why we use that is because we want to make sure that every single student was given the exact same set of instructions. Otherwise, if we allow a proctor to dictate how the instructions will be delivered, well, it could be that one proctor is having a great day and would be very friendly, whereas another one could be a grumpy proctor, and that could really impact the results of the score. So to keep it all consistent, a structured interview, which allows us to get some depth and information about the participant, is better. A case study, sometimes also known as a clinical study, allows us to study in depth a person or a small group of people. And this is, again, to be able to understand why they're going through what they're going through. In therapy, often this is what's used to try to understand a person. In fact, Sigmund Freud and the psychoanalytic perspective gave way and based his theory on case studies. The biggest criticism behind this was that a young woman who would be coming to Freud, typically middle-aged, white female would perhaps be understood by Freud, and maybe he was able to help her. However, his approach to generalize his findings from that one participant to all women who suffer from similar things is what really makes it difficult for us to see the validity behind it. We cannot generalize based on one person that all others would be the same. And this is what a case study does. So that's the con. The pros is that it can allow us to get some insight into the developmental process that someone went through. So when we try to understand why a person behaves the way they do, it is important to understand the relationship they had with their father, with their mother, their living conditions, and understanding everything that Bronfenbrenner said, from the micro to the macro system. And ethnography is basically an approach that is aimed toward understanding a group of people in a culture that is different to the one that the person researching may be from. For example, you may have seen individuals that had gone over to Africa maybe to do some dissertation or some research. Well, in order for them to really understand what is going on in Africa, they cannot just read about it. They oftentimes go and immerse themselves in that culture, and through there they understand why people do what they do. And that is often considered to be a very noble and clear way of understanding people and their culture. The previous studies and ways in how we acquire information are not the end-all be-all. Those are just ways in how we acquire information. In order for us to understand general research, we have to make use of what's known as inferential statistics. And there are different types of designs that allow us to study this. We'll start off with correlational research. Correlational research is a type of study, inferential study, that allows us to view if there is in fact a relationship between two sets of variables. This is basically studied to determine whether one is affected by the other. This is typically mathematically represented through numbers ranging from 0, negative 1.0, to positive 1.0. With 0 being in the middle, you have negative 1.0, and then you have positive 1.0. With 0 being in the middle, that would basically mean that there's no relationship or no correlation. When we talk about a correlational design, we're talking about variables that are associated with one another. And again, in order for us to establish that there is in fact an association between the variables, you must either get closer to the negative 1.0 or closer to the positive 1.0. Again, if you land somewhere close to the 0, it would basically mean that there is no association or no correlation. One of the drawbacks of this study is that although it may allow us to find association between variables, it does not demonstrate causality, meaning we cannot say that one caused the other. For example, you may have heard of this example before. In the summer, we find that the higher the ice cream sales, the higher the crime rates, meaning the more ice creams are sold, the higher the number of crimes that are committed. Now, this would be an association or a correlation between ice cream sales and crimes. However, it is not stating that the more ice cream we sell, that the more crime that is committed. This is basically pointing toward a relationship or an association between these two. It is possible that there is a third variable that's affecting this relationship, and as stated before, the high temperature causes both the consumption of ice cream and also possibly a higher crime rate, as we often leave windows open to keep our houses cool, or maybe even road rage, or maybe we travel on vacation, therefore the houses are empty. So these are some of the other variables that could have influenced for these relationships to exist. As you may remember, the coefficient ranges from negative 1.0 to positive 1.0. If you are to the right of 0, then you're on a positive note. If you're to the left of 0, then you're in a negative. And what we find here is that a positive correlation basically means that as the value of one variable goes up, so will the other. So ice cream sales go up, crime rates go up. That's a positive correlation, both going up. A negative correlation is the opposite. It basically means that as the ice cream sales maybe go up, the other variable would go down. It doesn't necessarily have to be up and down. It could also be down and up. And it would still be a negative correlation. Notice that in the positive, both variables point toward the same direction. In the negative correlation, the variables point in opposite directions. So the example provided here, the more time I spend studying, the less hours I spend partying. And so you would see the more time I spend studying, the less time I spend partying. The less time I spend partying, the more time I spent studying. And you could see the relationship there. If you get anywhere close to 0, as it is the case here, it basically indicates that there is a weak or no relationship between the two. For example, the number of hours that I study and my height. It would basically imply that the more I study, the taller I would be. And as you may have guessed, there's no such relationship. The only way we can establish cause and effect relationships, which correlational design does not allow us to do, is through an experimental design. And an experimental design consists of an experiment. This is where we deliberately manipulate one variable and observe the effect that that manipulation had on another variable. For example, I want to see how lighting affects your test scores. So I will deliberately control the amount of light in the room, and then after I will measure your test score to see if the lighting had an effect on your test scores. Once again, this is the only method that can establish cause and effect relationships. So it is important for you to know that there is no other way we could do this. The manipulation that we see at the bottom here is basically that which you as a researcher would have to once again change deliberately something. In order for us to understand the relationship between the groups that are in question, we have to separate the big group into at least two groups. These groups are called the experimental or treatment group and the control group. The experimental or treatment group are those that receive a treatment. So for example, if I were to hypothesize that the brighter the room, the higher the test score would be, then this group here would receive higher lighting setting, a brighter setting. The control group would receive no treatment, meaning they would be testing in a room that is lit up to the average level. At the end, if I hypothesize that brighter room leads to higher test scores, then I could compare these two groups and see if in fact this one scored, the experimental group scored higher than the control group. If they did, then we could be certain that there's a cause effect between the independent variable and the dependent variable. What the independent variable and dependent variable are basically those variables that are manipulated in an experiment. In this case, I will be manipulating something that is light. I'll be manipulating lighting in the room, and the dependent variable would be the test scores. Now, this is the experiment or the example that I'm providing, but it could have been anything else. And as researchers have done in the past, they've hypothesized different things to try to understand the effect they have in our lives. There's one more thing that we ought to do before we can be certain that our findings are due to the manipulation of the independent variable. And that is, we need to randomly assign participants to one of the groups. As you may remember, we either had the experimental group, also known as treatment, and we were going to compare that to the control group. So the treatment and control. And what we are going to do is we have to assign people to this side, and we also have to assign people to this side. Now, in order for this to be a true experiment, we must randomly assign people there, meaning I cannot get my favorite people on the treatment group, and by favorite I may mean maybe those who sit in the front or those who participate in class, because that would make the study or the experiment biased. In order for this to be a true experiment, I must randomly assign them. And by random, we mean by chance, meaning like if you flip the coin, which is an unbiased way of assigning people in there, then this could guarantee that those who sit in the front as well as those who sit in the back had an equal opportunity to be assigned to either of the groups. If at the end the results show that those students in the treatment or experimental condition scored higher than those in the control group, then we would say we had a significant outcome, meaning that it looks as though the lighting has an impact on our test scores. However, if it didn't, then we would say that our results are inconclusive. And by inconclusive, we mean that we cannot state the opposite. We just maybe failed to find enough evidence in there. However, even if you were to find or get a significant outcome, which would be good for the researcher and for our understanding of test taking, it is not enough with just one study. In order for us to be certain of the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable, we must replicate research. That means that after conducting an experiment in our class, I may have to go over to the class next door and ask them if they could participate in a study again. And based on that, I could go to the next building, to the next campus, to a next state, and then the more studies that reveal similar findings, the more certain I am that the relationship between lighting and test scores exists. For those of you that are visual learners, here is a picture that would allow us to understand the experimental design process. The question here is, does propranolol reduce stress? Propranolol is basically a medicine that is being studied to see if it has an effect on our stress levels. Because of the way it's worded, we know that propranolol would be the independent variable and stress would be the dependent variable. So we identify our participants here and we assign them randomly to either one of the groups. Assuming that this was an unbiased assignment, you could see that these individuals are getting the treatment and these guys at the bottom get no treatment. At the end, we measure the dependent variable, in which you see the little chimp being attached to an EKG. We measure their heart rate, and based on the findings, we hope that this group here had a lower stress level than this other group at the bottom. If they did, and we compare the two, then we would say we had a significant outcome. If we did not get a significant outcome, then we would see that the results are inconclusive. Once again, in order for us to be certain of the relationship that may exist, we need to replicate the study. In addition to these two research designs that we were just exposed to, it is important that you understand that developmental psychologists make use of three other research designs quite regularly. And that is because it allows us to compare the changes, the consistencies or changes that exist in people as we age. The most popular of these designs is the cross-sectional research design. And the reason why it's popular is because it is short, it is convenient, and allows us to be able to understand the changes that can occur among different groups of people. If we look at the cross-sectional research, it basically compares the differences among groups of people. And if we were to look at the example provided here, measuring the IQ scores between 25, 45, and 65-year-olds could be simply done by advertising this for a month or two and getting people from our community to come over on a Saturday morning and taking a traditional IQ test. We could pair them up as 25-year-olds and 45 and 65-year-olds, and at the end we could compare the three groups to one another and see which one had the highest test scores. You could see in here that maybe some people would hypothesize that the 25-year-olds would have the highest test scores. Some people may say, no, it's the 65-year-olds that had the highest test scores, or maybe others even 45. The problem with this is that, well, we may end up with a number that would reveal who seems to be the most intelligent when using an IQ test. We cannot be sure that the findings are due to age differences alone. And this is due to something that we call the cohort effect. A cohort effect is basically a condition that is brought forth to perhaps a class or a generation or a group of people. For example, you may know someone, in fact maybe your parents or grandparents, who may have successfully made it through life with some financial comfort, despite the fact that they may have not gone to college. I know my parents and grandparents did not go to college, and yet they were able to afford a house, and they were able to do things that now it seems that for younger people, if you don't go to college, you could probably kiss the house goodbye. And that's a cohort effect. Younger generations require and are exposed to more college than previous generations. Therefore, if we were to bring 65 and 45-year-olds to the mix in comparison to 25-year-olds, it's possible that based on the questions that are in the traditional IQ test, the 25-year-olds would score higher, but it would not be due to age alone. It would be due to the era in which the 65-year-olds lived and the era in which the 25-year-olds live. Another popular study, but not so common because of how expensive it can be, is the longitudinal research. This one seeks to see the behavior changes as they occur throughout the lifespan of an individual. So they assess change in behavior over time. Looking at the example we looked earlier about intelligence, we could probably bring in a group of people as young as 5 years old and assess them every 20 years for the next 60 years. And by doing so, I can study and note the changes or consistencies that occur as I bring them in at the age of 25, and then 20 years later, and 20 years later. At the end, I would have an understanding of how their intelligence progressed throughout their adolescent years and through middle adulthood and even past that point. The problem with this is that, as you may have guessed, I'm currently 31 years old, and I would probably die by the time these 5-year-olds would get to 65. And it is very expensive when it comes down to time, because we have to wait for participants to age, and in that waiting period, individuals may drop out, meaning they often move away, they sometimes die, sometimes they get married and change their names, and we have no way of tracking them down. And this really makes it difficult for us to get the answers that we need. Another dropout or limitation is, limitation is that participants may become test-wise. So the first time they came, they may have been excited and truthful in their responses, but as they came the second time and the third time, they may have already outsmarted the test, and that could also influence our results. Because of the limitations of the longitudinal and cross-sectional, a third approach and a third research design has been presented, and that is the sequential research design. This tries to make up for limitations in cross-sectional and longitudinal by following a group of individuals over a period of time, but not making it as long as the longitudinal. For example, we could have a group of 5-year-olds and follow them for a period of 10 years, while simultaneously studying a group of 25-year-olds and follow them for 10 years, and simultaneously bring in 45-year-olds and follow them for 10 years, and we could even bring in 65-year-olds and follow them for 10 years. As you can see, we have 4 groups that we would simultaneously study over a period of 10 years. By the time we are done understanding them, we would have grasped an understanding of the entire lifespan in just a matter of 10 years, rather than waiting 60 years for the individuals to age. Well, this could be convenient. The problem with this in here is that the 65-year-olds today would not be equivalent to the 5-year-olds today. For example, if you have access to a toddler or a baby, you'll know that today's babies seem to come pre-wired with the ability and skills to work an iPhone or a tablet, whereas the 65-year-olds, they would have not gotten exposed to that, so their development would have been different because of the absence of a tablet, whereas the development of the younger kids today would have been different because of the presence of that. Lastly, I'd like to talk about ethics in relation to doing research with children. The American Psychological Association, which is the APA, seeks to ensure that every participant in a study is protected from physical and mental harm. And in fact, that is their primary concern, that as we seek to discover truth and knowledge from our observations, that there be participants who are respected and that are not abused. In order to make sure that everyone is treated well, the APA requires that we make use of an informed consent. And this is basically a form or an explanation of what the study will be about. That way, a participant could make a decision as to whether they want to participate or not. If the child is a minor, there often is a requirement from the parent or the teacher to be involved. However, after the age of 7, the APA mandates that a child, if cognitively healthy and aware and able-bodied, should be able to write their name or initials if they choose to participate. The right to privacy also means that we must protect the identity and the responses of the individuals, meaning we cannot force them to write their names, as this can be detrimental for them as well. And at the end, once we conduct the study, we must debrief on what our hypothesis is and let them know once we get the results, out of courtesy, what the outcomes were. All in all, this is basically how we conduct research and how we seek to understand the way humans develop and how we come to be who we are as adults.